Okay, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited, as always, to have back Dr. Jamie Marich. Jamie, welcome back.
Glad to be back. I think this is time 4, so it's always a joy to
Amazing.
talk to you. Yeah.
So, Jamie speaks internationally on EMDR therapy, trauma addiction, dissociation, expressive arts, yoga, and mindfulness, and runs a private practice and online training network in her home base of Akron, Ohio. She's written numerous books, notably Trauma and the 12 Steps and Inclusive Guide to Recovery, as well as Dissociation Made Simple, a stigma-free guide to embracing a dissociative mind and navigating life. Her new book is titled You Lied to Me About God and is scheduled to come out October 15th. Jamie, always, let me just say before I say welcome to the podcast, every time I'm just so impressed and inspired and awed and humbled and intimidated about everything you do. I mean, like Jesus, how much? And not just that, but a voice. And I think I said it the last time. Your voice in the larger community of mental health and more specifically trauma is searing. We need it. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Lovely, lovely to be welcomed.
Yeah. So, all right. Quickly, as an intro, remind our listeners before we get going here where you're from originally and where you are currently.
I'm originally from Youngstown, Ohio, which is just about an hour to the east of where I live now in Akron, Ohio, all on Erie Nation land. I'm actually, I think since we talked last, maybe not. I'm officially a Croatian citizen. My family is from Croatia, and I did live
Oh,
there in Croatia and Bosnia for 3 years. And as part of my healing process and journey with the ancestral trauma, it felt very important to formally pursue citizenship since I do spend a lot of time in the country. And yes, so I'm technically Croatian American and very proud of my roots.
congratulations.
Thank you.
So, this new book,
Yeah.
You Lied to Me About God. Why? Why did you write this book?
Because I want to validate people's experience that religious trauma, spiritual abuse is real. And it does not necessarily happen in what we classically code as cults. Because I think when people hear cult, they think something that a Netflix documentary gets made about, something that's very likely to make the news. Yet I grew up in two very mainstream religions that each of my parents practiced and experienced serious wounding as a result. I've been fascinated in validating spiritual trauma, spiritual abuse as a valid form of trauma throughout my career as a trauma educator. I always talk about it when I have a platform. And I knew I couldn't write the book on it unless it was a memoir.
Mm.
I even told my publisher that yeah, I could write you a technical principles of spiritual abuse book. Yet a lot of my books, as you know, have very personal qualities in them. And that's just the way I write. Yet this story was so personal for me to share that a major part of why I wrote it too was really for a lot of my own healing, that it's time to tell the world what's made me tick. And that's having recovered from this kind of experience.
How do you define spiritual abuse?
Yeah. My quick and easy definition, it is whenever God or any spiritual construct, that could be something like enlightenment, because a lot of the spiritual but not religious crowd also falls prey to perpetuating spiritual abuse also. So it's whenever God or any spiritual construct is used as a weapon to control or to demean others. Abuse, as we know, there's generally a power differential present. And in spiritual abuse, the major power differentials we're seeing would be either parent to child, faith leader to their congregant or their follower. That could be guru to disciple, priest to parishioner, etc. And increasingly, we're identifying where spiritual abuse can happen at the level of the state, where people in charge are doing things to control others in the name of religious conviction. And we've had examples of that throughout history. And I think a lot of us in the US are finally calling it that in these current times. So spiritual abuse is often conflated with religious trauma. Many years now, a person named Marlene Winnell coined the term religious trauma syndrome. I tend not to use that because I don't think it's just about religion. Because part of what I share in my book is, yes, I grew up in two very conservative Christian religions. My parents were two different denominations within Christianity. They couldn't stand each other's denominations, but they hated a lot of the same things. And then later, as part of my own spiritual seeking, I ended up studying yoga pretty deeply and was in and out of a yoga ashram for 5 years, even as I was Jamie Marich, a professional, studying yoga, but also wondering if I was missing something spiritually. And I saw that a lot of the same patterns of power and control that I encountered in religion were also present in yoga contexts. And those are well documented as well. And so that's why I tend to lean more into spiritual abuse as a definition, because I think it involves this notion that it can be more than just religion.
So let's get specific. How did this play out for you specifically as a young kid?
So part of what makes my story unique, because there's a lot of coming out of religion stories, especially for those of us who are queer, and your holy parents tell you things like you're an abomination, you're this, you're that, you're going to hell for being who you are. And that can be horrible enough and shaking enough on development. So I was born to, again, Croatian American parents. My parents were born Roman Catholic and were married Roman Catholic. I was born into a Roman Catholic family. And then when I was about 5, my father converted to an evangelical group that was very not just anti-gay, anti-woman, they were also anti-Catholic. So my parents became at odds with each other about faith and religion issues in my house from when I was about 5. And I tell people this a lot, that I was raised with one Catholic parent, one evangelical parent in the same house. And it's like, how did you navigate it? And it was tough as a kid to navigate it, because both parents legitimately thought their way was the right way. Now, my Catholic mother was a little softer, but part of the toxicity was that my father was actively trying to convert her. From when I was young as 5, 6, I remember him telling me things like, your mother's going to hell, your grandparents are going to hell, unless they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, the way that my church teaches it. So in addition to a lot of the garden variety messaging I heard about gays being horrible and going to hell, and abortion and feminism are the manifestations of the devil and being put down a lot in the name of God. Again, any of that would have been bad enough, I think, for a sensitive kid. But then having to navigate a lot of spiritual conflict in the house just made it horrendous. Like, I tell a story in the book about how I was 8 years old and my parents literally asked me my opinion on a doctrine matter about the Immaculate Conception, which is this teaching that Mary was born without sin. Catholics believe in it very fervently. Evangelicals do not, because they think Catholics worship Mary and put that down. And my parents were arguing about this, which was pretty commonplace because my mom decided to stay married. And they asked me, well, what do you think about it? And I was 8 and trying to come up with a diplomatic answer, because I was that oldest hero child anyway, that was always trying to play diplomat. But I knew answering in any one way would make the other parent angry. And so I remember after one of these arguments that happened probably when I was much later as a teenager, I plopped down on my bed and I said, this has to be what spiritual abuse is. Because I had enough cognizance in my head that emotional abuse was a thing, physical abuse, sexual abuse was a thing, even though I wouldn't learn until much later what all that meant clinically. But in that moment as a teenager, I just got so fed up with feeling like I was a pawn in their religious game. And I would often hear things like, I'm going to lose you yet. I'm going to lose you to your father's church, or I'm going to lose you to your mother's church. And as I write in the book, no child should have to be worried about that.
Right.
And I think it would have been bad enough if, being who I am as somebody who's queer and outspoken and feminist, I was growing up in either one of the two faiths that were pretty traditional expressions. But with having them at odds constantly, added just another layer to me getting very frustrated with God, religion, and Jesus. Yet a lot of what I share in the book is through my own trauma recovery journey and healing journey. I've actually come out of it still very much a person of faith. My spirituality, my spiritual life is very important to me. But the title of the book, You Lied to Me About God, comes from that in my trauma recovery personal work, I've had to unpack a lot of the messages, the lies that were told to me, not just about God, but lies that were told to me about myself in God's name.
I'm just, I can't fathom, Jamie, what this did and would do to you and to anyone. I mean, it just feels like any kind of grounding or stability or mooring that one would need as a young person growing up was not only didn't seem to be shaky, but it seemed to be condemning and dismissive and pejorative and calling into question the very foundation of who you were as a person.
Yes.
Abusive.
Yes. And I think, and I want to be very clear before I go on, because I know a lot of people who believe or people of faith listen to your podcast. I am not anti-religion. I'm not anti-faith. What I do get concerned about and what I am very much opposed to are when you use that religion or those faith beliefs to try to wield power and influence and control over other people, especially children. Because kids, we have a lot of these discussions in spiritual abuse discourse about who is most vulnerable to it. Like, who is most vulnerable to join a cult? Who is most vulnerable to be blindsided by a teacher or a faith leader or whatnot? And in discussing vulnerability, several of my peers and I have just really concluded the act of being a child makes you vulnerable just by being a child. Because when you're a kid growing up in a house, your parents or your guardians, who's ever feeding you, really becomes your God figure.
Right.
And yeah, we know as trauma therapists, the horrible things you get told about yourself in these contexts can be reason enough to end up in trauma therapy. Yet when the divine is brought into that, and something else that we acknowledge is spiritual abuse can be tied in with a lot of other forms of abuse too. For example, a lot of parents or other people who sexually abuse can say things like, this is what God wants, or children obey their parents, and if you're not obeying me on this, then you're displeasing God. So that was not directly a part of my experience, but it is an experience that a lot of people have who are still tangled up in spiritual abuse, is when God is used to just justify a lot of horrible behaviors. And I think where that especially hit me hard is everything about me loves spiritual connection, connecting with something larger than myself. And that's why, even though for many people who come out of toxic faith or toxic religion, leaving any kind of faith or God altogether is where they go, and that's their right, that never would have worked for a soul like ours, because we've longed for something to connect to outside of ourselves. And for us, that's still the divine. For a lot of people, it is more about making connections with nature, making connections with each other, and seeing the spiritual quality in that. But I think if you were ever the kind of kid who was told you're too sensitive, and you tend to be seeking some kind of deeper meaning, it makes you especially vulnerable to being hurt whenever God is used as this weapon.
You talked about being a teenager and
Mm-hmm.
kind of being on the bed and asking
Yeah.
yourself, being aware, cognizant of what was going on. What did it look like for you during that time, day to day? How were you living? How were you reacting? What was your self conception in a sense, your belief in yourself?
So remember, I've been on this podcast before talking about our dissociative disorder. And honestly, a lot of
Enter dissociation.
enter dissociation. Yes. A lot of how we coped with that was to dissociate. And in the memoir, we actually speak directly about how our three dissociative parts formed, our major parts at 4, 9, and 19. And we talk in the memoir about just really bad things that happened at all three of those ages that all directly involved my dad's, especially my dad's,
Hmm.
just the spiritual viciousness. So here was the interesting thing about the day to day. And yeah, a lot of my childhood I have blocked out because the dissociation really became how I coped through a lot of this. But a lot of the vivid memory I do have, and this is what made it tricky for me, and I think could make it tricky. This is what causes disorganized attachment. In a lot of ways, on a lot of days, our home seemed great.
Hmm.
My dad was a wonderful dad in a lot of ways. And then something would seem like it caused him to snap. And I think that would have happened even if he wasn't religious, that there were some other things going on and he suddenly became temperamental and angry. But then when God entered the picture, it just became very like you can even see now it could still get hard for me to talk about because we were me especially I did have a brother, and sometimes when I say me I mean me, sometimes when I say we I mean me and my parts, but we were just cut to the core by a lot of things dad would say in God's name or to try to scare us into complying. Like, you're going, I heard so much, you're going to go to hell if you're going to lose your salvation if. And it could sometimes be innocuous as something like watching a movie or listening to rock music. I mentioned in the book how uh, my dad did not like anything modernly secular on TV. This was in the 80s and early 90s. No secular music. And so I had cousins who lived one street over, and I loved hanging out with them because they just seemed like they were normal kids doing normal
Hmm.
things that normal kids did. And they provided a lot of the kind of attachment needs that I was lacking. And even sometimes with dad, there was inconsistency about that. Like one summer we'd be fine to watch certain Disney movies, and other summers like it's of the devil, and whatnot. And then I was one of the churches I was raised at was his evangelical. It was, I'm not going to say the denomination here on the interview. You could read it in the book, but it was a particular denomination where in the 90s there was this push towards like purity culture, and anything about kind of normal sexual development was just shut down as it's not of God. You wait until you get married. And I remember the youth group sponsored a big book burning my junior year of high school, between my junior and senior year. And yeah, like now when I see in the news things about book burning and book banning, it's very real to me because I grew up with this in the 90s, that we were told as part of youth group to bring your books, your CDs, anything that was not of God, meaning anything that was secular. So I remember kids bringing their Disney movies and their Sarah McLachlan CDs and that getting like torched in the fire. So yeah, there was also a sense that I felt I couldn't really connect with what other kids my age were connected
Hmm.
with. And I know a lot of people who grew up religious or especially extremely religious have this. So I'm not unique in that way. But yeah, I had a lot of gaps to fill in as part of my healing, because things that I thought were bad as a kid were really just things that other kids my age were doing and experiencing.
Hmm.
In the book, I talk about what it was like learning to date and kiss and like people when I was in junior high and high school. Very age appropriate stuff I've come to learn, especially as a professional. But so much of that was put down as evil by the church, the one church especially in which I was raised.
Was does shame come in to play
Oh,
here? Yeah.
oh yeah. And the book title really directly comes from so my favorite working definition of shame. It's the quote that starts chapter 1. Shame is the lie that someone told you about yourself. That is from Anais Nin, the feminist author. Shame is the lie that someone told you about yourself. I encountered that quote for the first time in 2005 when I was in the heart of my own deep trauma therapy. And it just really, really hit me, that quote. Yes, I knew, especially as someone in recovery from addiction, that shame was an issue. I carried other people's shame. I had shame for things that I did in addiction. And I've come to learn I've had shame for things I did when I was religious myself, very religious myself as a young person in my late teens. Left it alone for a while, became religious again in my early 20s. And then as I started studying therapy and trauma, I just knew that I couldn't be religious in a traditional sense, the way either of my parents wanted me to be. So yes, shame is definitely a factor. But the reason I titled the book "You Lied to Me About God," as I shared earlier, it's not just that I've been carrying all these lies about myself. It's lies that people told me about myself in God's name. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of shame to heal from and unpack and comb through. And to be frank, even though we're in a much better place in our life right now, particularly with all these triggers for religious trauma surrounding us in the American
Mm.
political landscape, we are still actively healing. We're still actively wading through the waters of this because it can feel like it's everywhere.
You talked a little bit about your impetus for writing the book. Who's it for?
Mm. The simple answer is it's for anybody who likes memoir, because a lot of my other books have definitely been for more of a clinical audience. And even though Dissociation Made Simple is for more of a general audience than my other books, people who have some connection to the content typically
Mhm.
dive in. So this is being classified as memoir. So I know there's a lot of voracious memoir readers out there. So if a general reader finds it interesting, I think I tell some pretty good stories in it. Yet I think who may be most likely to pick it up are people who the title speaks to them because they know God trauma has been a factor for them. Religious trauma has been a factor for them. And my hope is that therapists who maybe know my work and will read anything I put out there will also pick it up. Because I think what I've seen in the clinical landscapes is that a lot of us who grew up religious or grew up in some kind of cult, we get it when our
Mhm.
clients come to us with this kind of material. But a lot of times I've done consultations where folks have said, I just didn't grow up that religious. Or if I did grow up, let's say Catholic or Presbyterian or whatnot, my parents weren't vicious about it, or my faith community wasn't vicious about it. So I hope that clinicians can pick this up who want to get a greater sense of insight into what it can be like for somebody who does grow up traditionally religious, where religion is brought in as a big factor in the trauma.
Speaking with Dr. Jamie Marich, the book is titled "You Lied to Me About God," set to come out in October. Just before we go, this is kind of a big question before we go, but how how did you get to a point where you were able to uh, come to a settlement or an appeased situation with the divine?
Mm-hmm. You're right. It's a big question, but I like your big question. uh, how did I come to a settlement? I give 12-step recovery credit for a lot of that. And as I say in the book, as I've said in my work, I acknowledge that 12-step settings have been a problem for a lot of people, that 12-step recovery is far from perfect. That's what a lot of my trauma in the 12-step books were about. But I started attending 12-step recovery meetings through someone I met in a Catholic church when I was working for the Catholic Church in my early 20s. Whole big story. You could read it in the book. I'll just summarize. I was working for the Catholic Church in my early 20s, and I knew I was struggling with addiction and mental health stuff. And my answer at that time was just go back to church, because the whole reason you're struggling is because you're not going to church. Mm-hmm. So I picked the gentler of the two churches in the two I was raised. And I started attending Catholic service pretty devotedly, and I was working for the Catholic Church in Europe. And I met a woman who ended up introducing me to the 12 steps. And it was there that I was introduced to this idea of God as I understand him, or God as I understand God. And it was very, I get chills now thinking of it, to have this woman who was religious, but in that context of a 12-step meeting, she dropped the religion talk. And it was just God, because we're all here for the same thing, because we're struggling with alcoholism and addiction. So I credit AA specifically for helping me find that loving God. Even a few years before seeking out AA, I had this great experience in nature in the mountains of Colorado, where I was so hung up with the Jesus stuff, because it felt like my parents were fighting over interpretations of Jesus's life. But I was in the mountains with a cousin of mine, and the cousin was just like, isn't this amazing that God has created all of this? And I didn't doubt it. It was nothing that struck me as untrue to give God credit for this. So that's why I very much experience God in nature. And I think for many people, that is a valid spiritual path for them, is to connect with nature. So I say a lot, Guy, I have no problems with God. I'm even cool with Jesus. It's what people have done in their name that's the problem. And when I really learned to separate the two and heal from the two, I've made my peace. So I hope that answers your very great question.
It does. You know, one of the things, I might have said this before, one of the things I really admire about you is you have this beautiful way of educating us through your own journey. You know, you present yourself, this is me.
Yeah.
In all of my texture and gloriousness and quote unquote faults and victories, you know, and I benefit from that because it's freaking human. And I know a lot of people benefit from that.
Thank you. And thank you. And to that point, I have this line in the book that in a lot of my previous books, like Dissociation Made Simple, Trauma and the 12 Steps, EMDR Made Simple, I'm candid about the fact that I struggled with suicidal ideations and gestures for much of my early life. I'm candid about a lot of my mental health struggles. I don't really, in those books, though, give you the why. And this book will give you the why. And I felt it was important to be honest about this story, that for very sensitive people, bullying and religion, which were my two traumas, might be enough to set someone into that place.
Yeah.
So if you like my work, if you follow my work, you're going to get to know me a heck of a lot better in this book.
All right. So to that end, how do people reach you? What's the best way, Jamie?
Yeah, you can just go to myname.com, jamiemarich.com. That links you to all my other projects, including Institute for Creative Mindfulness, which is my EMDR training program. And we also have a free resources site now at redefinetherapy.com. Everything I've done for free is online at that site. And then if you just search my name on all the socials, you'll find me there.
Okay. We'll have those linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Jamie, awesome as always having you on here. You're welcome back as always, anytime you want. Look forward to the new book coming out.
Thank you so much, Guy.
All right. Take care.